This is the third tutorial on Fly Me to the Moon. In previous tutorials I've played the tune, I've played the root notes, I've looked at the harmony, I've talked about chords 5, dominant 7th chords, I've talked about relative minor, I've talked about moving to other keys temporarily, I've talked about the fact it's 32 bars and how it's really 2 A sections with a slight variation at the end. So you should be quite familiar now with this tune. I'm going to look at the scales that you can play to fit the harmony, but I'm also going to look at a couple of phrases because improvisation shouldn't sound like scales, but obviously you need to know what to play over certain chords. The overall harmony is reflected, the overall scale that can be used over the whole sequence is, if I'm playing it in A flat major, it's A flat major. If you're an alto sax and you're in F major, it's F major. That's our home key. Our home can be any key, whatever the key signature says, whatever you feel good about playing in, whatever the singer wants to play in. So particularly with this tune, there isn't a specific key. And as I explained in previous tutorials, I chose the key of A flat major to play my version because it's easier to sing. And at the time that I wrote it, I was designing a course for my jazz summer school, and I like to include the singers. So I'm going to be playing it in A flat major. But as I said, you can play it in any key. So you would obviously need to know major scales in all keys. So the overall scale would be A flat major or whatever key you're in. And that fits most of the chords in the first 4 bars, and I'll just play that. Obviously just sounds like me playing a load of scales as the chords change, but that's kind of at least confirms that it's the correct scale to fit those chords. Now it's not the only thing, but often we do want just something simple to get going. Now that's all going great. Bar 5, we could do the same thing. Unfortunately, at times the chords change, and we sometimes have to think outside that scale, outside that box. So at the end of chord 4, I put in a dominant 7th. So I went from chord 1 to chord 1 with a flat 7. Therefore making the next chord seem like a modulation, like a move. As I explained, it isn't really a modulation, it's just a temporary kind of, just makes you, it fools your ears to think you've gone somewhere, but we're not there for very long. But you would have to alter your scale because obviously the 7th would be major. So all you need to do is just flatten it. Just flatten the 7th. You might know this scale as the Mixolydian, you might know it as the dominant 7th scale. So now it would sound like this. It's there for a second. You'll be lucky to even think about it. As long as you don't hammer out the major 7th, it should be fairly easy. Of course, you could just avoid the 7ths by playing other types of scales, like a pentatonic scale, which avoids the 7th altogether. That's worth knowing. So you're literally there for about a second, and I'll show you what I mean. So you could be playing a phrase. I'll try that one again. I just improvised that. And I just went literally from the major 7th, slightly different one there, but you can hear how I focused on the 7th and went to the flat 7. So you would need to know to adapt your scale or your line to reflect that. Then we move to chord 4. Now, as I said, this does kind of sound like a modulation, so just to make it clear, obviously on chord 4 we're still in our home key, and I can just play that. Sounds fine. but you might feel like starting the scale on that note that you're on, so whatever note is the start of chord 4, and you would get this scale if you kept the same key signature. And if you've seen the tutorial on modes, you'll know that that's the Lydian mode. Now, is it a Lydian mode, or is it just, are we just, making it more complicated? Are we just still in the home key? It's both, really. It's just the Lydian mode is the same scale, just starting on the 4th. So, but I only mention that because the chord before it sounds like a dominant 7th. So our ears are kind of hearing it as a modulation, but really it's still in the same key. Then we have this 2-5-1 into the relative minor. And for that, you need to adapt what you're playing. So for the chord 2, you can still play the same home key scale. If you actually started it on chord, it would be chord 7, because you remember we talked about that pivot chord. So if I'm in the key of A flat, I'm going to start on the 7th, which is a G. So it would be the same scale as we played before, but just starting on the 7th. And if I was talking about modes, that would be the Locrian mode. Okay, so that fits nicely. And the chord type is a minor 7 flat 5. But it doesn't really work so well for the next chord. If I did play that with that, we wouldn't have one of the vital ingredients, which is the major third, to make it sound like a dominant 7th, to enable us to modulate. So you have to adapt. What I want you to consider is that chord 5 really belongs to chord 1. So when we have this, I'm thinking in terms of the minor. And one of the common minor scales is a harmonic minor. Sounds like this. And if I play that scale, but I start it on the 5th, you'll get this sound. That's pretty cool. Anything with a flat 2 often sounds a bit exotic. I quite like it anyway. It's actually called the Phrygian dominant, I think. I had to look it up because I just call it the 5th mode of the melodic minor. You can call it whatever you like, but as long as you know what the notes are, that's the most important thing. So at that point, when we're doing the dominant 7th to go to our new relative minor, that fits great. And then when we get to the minor chord, I could play the harmonic minor, but the trouble is the chord has got a flat 7th. So I would have to adapt my chord to have a major 7th. Now people do that, but if we just keep fairly strictly to the minor 7, we need to adapt that. So we could just play, just be back in our home key. Or we could make the 6th natural, which sounds quite cool, which would be a Dorian scale. We could play a pentatonic scale. So whatever we do, we need to make sure that our scales reflect the chords. That can be tricky sometimes, especially if you've got a very adventurous pianist playing some major 7ths when you're hammering out your flat 7ths. But in general, if it's a flat 7, you want to play a flat 7 in your scale. So I'm just going to play those 3 bars. This is the minor 2-5-1. So here's chord 2 with a flat 5. And the chord 5. And the chord 1. I'm just going to play a couple of bebop licks that would fit this sequence, and then in the next tutorial I'm going to show you how you can use them. So I'm just going to demonstrate the first one, which is a 2-5-1 lick over 2-5-1 major lick. And that could be nicely inserted into 2-5-1s in this particular sequence. When we talk about the minor 2-5-1 lick, this is one that could be inserted. Now I made this slightly similar to the other one, but it had to adapt it slightly. So here's our minor 2-5-1 lick. And that's the end of tutorial 3.